Hello and welcome. My name is Alan. Today we are back with more Testament of Hope by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Let's go ahead and hop in where we was last time. Picking up with Rabbi Gindler. Thank you very much, Dr. King. Perhaps we could share now a few questions relating to some of the domestic issues of poverty. A couple of them ask about the Kerner report. If the Kerner report recommendations are implemented, will it make a difference? What is your opinion on the report of the Kerner Commission? Another raises the question of people of good intentions wanting to deal with slum problems and hardly knowing what to do, feeling that most of the simple tutoring and palliative efforts in the communities may not amount to much. Even the entire context of the system. It speaks of the power structure, the establishment finding funds for supersonic transports, moon projects, technological developments, which are mere luxuries for Vietnam, but not for those persisting needs which affect millions here at home. Can you suggest why the establishment seems to work in this way? Is it an accident, or does it have deeper causes? What seems to you the minimal changes needed in the system in order to achieve some greater measure of social justice and equality? And perhaps related to this and the question of some of the realistic goals of the Poor People's Campaign to be held in Washington beginning April the 22nd. Dr. King. Thank you. I want to start this answer by reiterating something that I said earlier, that is that we do face a great crisis in our nation. Even though the president said today that we have never had it so good, we must honestly say that for many people in our country, we've never had it so bad. Poverty is a glaring, notorious reality for some 40 million Americans. I guess it wouldn't be so bad for them if it were shared misery, but it is poverty and plenty. It is poverty in the midst of an affluent society, and I think this is what makes for great frustration and great despair in the black community and the poor community of our nation generally. In the past, in the civil rights movement, we have been dealing with segregation and all of the humiliation. We've been dealing with the political problems of the denial of the right to vote. I think it is absolutely necessary now to deal massively and militantly with the economic problem. If this isn't dealt with, we will continue to move, as the Kerner Commission said, toward two societies, one white and one black, separate and unequal. So the grave problems facing us is the problem of economic deprivation with the syndrome of bad housing and poor education and improper health facilities all surrounding this basic problem. This is why in SCLC we came up with the idea of going to Washington, the seat of the government, to dramatize the gulf between the promise and fulfillment, to call attention to the gap between the dream and the realities, to make the invisible visible. All too often in the rush of everyday life, there is a tendency to forget the poor, to overlook the poor, to allow the poor to become invisible. And so this is why we are calling our campaign a poor people's campaign. We are going to Washington to engage in nonviolent direct action in order to call attention to this great problem of poverty and to demand that the government do something more than a token, something in a large manner to grapple with the economic problem. We know from the experiences in the past that the nation does not move on questions involving genuine equality for the black man unless something is done to bring pressure to bear on Congress and the appeal to the conscience and the self interest of the nation. I remember very well that we had written documents by the Civil Rights Commission at least 3 years before we went to Birmingham, recommending very strongly all of the things that we dramatized in our direct action in Birmingham. But the fact is that the government did not move, Congress did not move, and we developed a powerful, vibrant movement in Birmingham, Alabama. 2 years before we went into Selma, the Civil Rights Commission recommended that something be done in a very strong manner to eradicate the discrimination Negroes faced in the voting area in the South, and yet nothing was done about it until we went into Selma, mounted a movement, and really engaged in action geared toward the nation away from the course that it was following. I submit this evening that we have had numerous documents, numerous studies, numerous recommendations made to the economic question, and yet nothing has been done. The things that we are going to be demanding in Washington have been recommended by the President's Commission on Technology, Automation, and the Environment and Economic Progress. The same things were recommended at the White House Conference on Civil Rights. The Urban Coalition came into being after the Detroit riot and recommended these things. The Kerner Commission came out just a few days ago recommending some of the same things that we will be demanding. I think it is basically a very sound, realistic report on the conditions with some very sound recommendations, and yet nothing has been done. Indeed, the president himself has not made any more movement implementing any of the recommendations of that commission. I am convinced that nothing will be done until enough people of goodwill get together to respond to the kind of movement that we will have in Washington and bring these issues out in the open enough so that the congressmen who are in no mood at the present time to do anything about this problem will be forced to do something about it. I have, er, I have seen them change in the past. I remember when we first went up and talked to the civil rights about a civil rights bill in 1963, right after it had been recommended by President Kennedy on the heels of the Birmingham movement. Mr. Dirksen was saying that it was unconstitutional, particularly Title I dealing with the integrated public accommodations. He was showing us that it was unconstitutional. Yet, we got enough people moving. We got rabbis moving. We got priests moving. We got Protestant clergymen moving. And they were going around Washington and they staying on top of it. They were lobbying. They were saying to Mr. Dirksen and others that this must be done. Finally, the Congress changed altogether. One day, when Senator Russell saw the civil rights bill would be passed and that the Southern wing would not defeat it, he said we could have blocked this thing if these preachers hadn't stayed around Washington so much. Now the time has come for the preachers and everybody else to get to Washington and get this very recalcitrant Congress to see that it must do something and that it must do it soon, because I submit that if something isn't done similar to what it recommended by the Kerner Commission, we are going to have organized social disruption. Our cities are going to continue to go up in flames. More and more black people will get frustrated, and the extreme voices calling for violence will get a greater hearing in the black community. So far, they have not influenced many, but I contend that if something isn't done very soon to deal with this basic economic problem, to provide jobs and income for all of America, then the extremist voices will be heard more and more. And those who are preaching nonviolence will often have their words falling on deaf ears. This is why we feel that this is such an important campaign. We need a movement now to transmute the rage of the ghetto into a positive, constructive force. And here again, we feel that this movement is so necessary because the anger is there. The despair is growing every day. The bitterness is very deep. And the leader has the responsibility of trying to find an answer. I have been searching for that answer a long time, over the last 18 months. I can't see the answer in riots. On the other hand, I can't see the answer in tender applications for justice. I see the answer in an alternative to both of these, and that is a militant nonviolence that is massive enough and is attention getting enough to dramatize the problems. That will be attention getting as a riot and will not destroy life or property in the process. And this is what we hope to do in Washington through our movement. We feel that there must be some structural changes now. There must be a radical reordering of priorities. There must be a de-escalation and a final stopping of the war in Vietnam and an escalation of the war against poverty and racism here at home. And I feel that this is the only going to be done when enough people get together and express their determination through the togetherness and make it clear that we are not going to allow any military industrial complex to control this country. One of the great tragedies of the war in Vietnam is that it has strengthened the military industrial complex, and it must be made clear now that there are some programs that we can cut back on. The space program and certainly the war in Vietnam, and get on with this program of a war on poverty. Right now, we don't even have a skirmish against poverty. And we really need an all-out mobilized war that will make it possible for all of God's children to have the basic necessities of life. So yeah, I'll end that episode there, or finish reading that part there, which will leave us about one more piece to read, one more episode. But yeah, Dr. King pointing out, look, we can't fall into the will to be violent, but we must be organized. We must fight against poverty. And you notice he calls it a poor people's campaign, not a poor African Americans campaign. He's wanting to point out, look, we are fighting poverty. Unfortunately, there is a growing divide, which we see it even worse in today with everything, that there is a divide between rich and poor. But yeah, I'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next episode. Until then, later.